All right, no more illegal activity. We're not going to talk about anything else that's illegal. Oh man. Well, so I've got to say as well, like I'm super impressed that you found the time to write the book. How did you fit that in with everything?
Oh, it was kind of like a 2-year process. So I really started like journaling and started putting pieces together. And I've always wanted to write a book, but once I started writing my second half, I kind of did it backwards. I was like, wow, I could really put this into book form. So it was a good 2-year process to put it all together.
Oh my gosh. I bet. So I have aspirations to write one of my own about vaping, and it always seems to get bumped down the priority list because it's not on fire. You know, like there's always something else that needs to be done right this very second, and so I never actually end up working on it. How
Yeah,
did
I
you did you like have dedicated writing time? What did you do? What's your secret?
Well, I try to find time for myself, and one of my favorite things to do is go in a sauna. And in a sauna, you have 45 minutes that you cannot have technology. So it was kind of like, okay, these are my 45 minutes where I'm going to write whatever I'm thinking. And that's kind of like how I use my time. Or like during the day when my kids came home from school and there was some quiet time, I would sit on the porch and just, say, oh, I have a really good idea I want to write about and do that. But it has been on the back burner for many years.
So writing in the sauna, does that mean that you actually like used a pen and paper? Like you
Yeah,
were actually
pen and paper.
wow.
Yes.
Wow. Okay. So that's probably how you really tap into the creative juices. You get away from the keyboard and you
Yes.
just let it out. All right. Well, maybe I should try that. Then maybe I'd write something. Oh man. All right. Well, Ashleigh, thank you for coming on the show. I really appreciate it. Let's talk a little bit about your book. So you recently published The Shadow Child. You've got it out. It's a great book. I've read it. It's also a very deeply personal book, talking about your history and your brother. Very very vulnerable. Can you talk a little bit about what led you to publish the book in the first place, and then what you're hoping to accomplish with it?
Sure. For the past 10 years, I've been like sharing my story of what it's like to have a sibling who uses substances. So that wasn't anything really new, but I've always wanted to put it in writing. But I really, I was like, do people really have anything to relate to? Does it matter to them? And then once my brother relapsed and I really started working on myself, and I started reading other books and I started journaling, and I was like, I'm sure there's other people who feel this way. And so, how can I put it down in a way that could benefit other people? So, the first half obviously is my story, and then the second half is like a toolbox of things I learned. So, working on that second half is really what just said, okay, you should write a book and share what you've learned with people.
So like the first half, it sounds like was very cathartic and just like getting out the story and getting, was it like truth through validation? Like people hear you and that makes it more real?
Yeah, I mean, the goal really was to show people who maybe don't know or don't live in this space, like how insane it really can be. Like you could say to somebody, "Oh, I'm going through a court proceeding with my loved one." Okay, well, cool. All right, what does that mean? So I really wanted to show people like this is how crazy things can go. And not only like an event happens, but how your mind is like going through everything that happened and what could have happened or what should have happened or if I should have done this or what if I did this. So I really wanted to open the eyes of people who maybe don't understand addiction or don't have it in their families and don't know what really goes on.
Yeah, either the people who don't know, or I feel like there's also folks who it's almost like a boiling frog syndrome, where I don't know if you've heard that phrase before, but where you're like in a pot of water and the temperature's just slowly rising, and so you don't really notice, like, oh my goodness, this water is really hot. I feel like there's some people and some families where they've they've been in it for so long that they don't understand that actually, like, oh no, this is really intense and this is really serious and this is not like this is not okay.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah,
maybe they'd see some of that reflected in your book too.
yes, definitely. When you're in it, you don't see it, and other people can look at you and they can pinpoint things, but when you're living in it, you don't see it because you're so close to it.
Right. Yeah. So the first half provides that anchor point, either for people who might be going through it and need to see it resonating somewhere else, or people who don't really understand just how incredibly chaotic it can be. But then I hear you saying that the meat and potatoes of it, really the reason why you wanted to write the book, was that you learned so much. And it sounds like if you could go back and talk to the younger Ashleigh, there's some things that right now you'd probably tell her that would have really helped. And that's really what the book is for.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. That's I wanted people to be like, this is where I am and how can I help myself? And instead of like, oh, well, read this book or read this book, I read the books and I pulled things out that I thought were really beneficial. And I'm like an example person. Like people can say, oh, set boundaries. Okay, well, what does that mean? So I tried to really put a lot of examples in there to show people like, this is what boundary setting, this is what it looks like, this is how you do it. Because I could have used that years ago.
Yeah, well, and I think that is one of the most interesting elements about families and addiction. It's such a complex system, and I say this as someone from the outside of it. I do not have a family member in addiction. I just work with folks who have gone through the struggle, either they themselves having the addiction or working with the families. And there are specific types of dynamics that we seem to see repeated over and over and over again, and that's what you've highlighted in your book. Of here are some of the dances that you get into inside a family where addiction is present, and here's how to break free from some of that. And then particularly from the lens of a sibling, is the title of your book, is the shadow child, the one who's not struggling. So from your perspective, what are some of these most damaging patterns, ones that other people potentially could look for in their families, or if they're struggling with it, what you think is the most useful for them to work on?
Well, I think siblings play a unique role because we don't necessarily, when we're younger, we don't have other people to turn to in struggle. Our parents are obviously struggling a lot with the sibling, which is definitely understandable, but we can't go to them and say, this is how I'm hurting too. So we find it hard to share those struggles. Where do we go? We go to school counselors. Do we see our own therapist? I don't think there is a lot of resources out there for parents in that role. And I think other damaging things, and it's really taken me a long time to see this, but you can find it in my book, is when we assume once our loved one gets sober that everything gets better, the family dynamics get better, coping skills get better, but in reality they don't. Those family dynamics are still there. Do things get better? Absolutely. There was more happy times, less fighting, but like when a stressor would happen in our family, we would all revert back to the same family dynamics. And I think that was really damaging, at least in my family's situation, because we didn't continue to work on ourselves after my brother went through treatment. And I think that hurt him, and I think it hurt us as a family unit.
Yeah. So kind of like there are these pre-existing patterns, or maybe even patterns that you hardwired during this period where someone has an addiction, where it's not just like it doesn't just get better. It's still there. It just was overshadowed perhaps by this massive elephant in the room that was the instability that the addiction caused.
Mm-hmm.
So what were, if you don't mind sharing, what were a couple of these scripts that you guys would cycle through? And have there been ways now that you've been able to change them?
Well, I can't, I think we missed a lot. We didn't see my brother's relapse coming. And I think that was something that was totally missed. And I'm sure now if we all like went back, we could have said, oh, I could pinpoint some of the family dynamics that maybe led to him relapsing or hurt him in the long run. But then I don't know. I think what we did forward is my parents and I met with a counselor, and we kind of like took everybody's perception and paid attention to how everybody viewed things differently. And we had never really done that before. So my mom has a tendency to cry. My dad has a tendency to get angry. I kind of shut down and process things. And this is throughout. And that continued. And I think once we sat down, the three of us, as a family, and said, yeah, okay, my dad gets mad, but that's how he copes and that's how he understands things. And you have to, meet him where he is. And this is how my mom is. That really helped. And I wish we would have done that sooner.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the most challenging aspects of working in any sort of intimate relationship with anyone, whether or not it's a family member, like emotionally intimate relationship, or a romantic partner, is the recognition that everyone has their raw spots. Everyone copes with problems differently. And although we all have the responsibility not to be hurting the people around us, at the same time, we can't expect for other people to deal with things the same way that we do, or to not have their own feelings, or to need some time to process. It's just, we're all different.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's easy to say, but when you've been in a family setting for so long and you've been coping with things for so long, it's hard to do that.
Right. It takes, I've always felt like change either takes a tremendous amount of willpower, harder to do, or discomfort, which is easier to do. When you're uncomfortable where you are, it's a lot easier to decide, okay, well, I'm going to move somewhere else, because staying the same feels really unappealing. But like, if you're used to coping with problems by getting angry, and that's accommodated in some way, for example, it's very easy to just keep doing it because it comes naturally, and it probably does blow off steam.
Right.
Or turtling up and isolating, and saying, all right, well, just shut everything out, and then I don't have to deal with it anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Until that shutting people out causes other problems, which I'm sure at some point it did, which is why you're talking about it now and working on it. Well, in the book, you describe several specific types of relational issues and dynamics that take place in families, and then ideas about what to do about them. We've already touched on one of them, so I figure maybe that's a good place to start, which are boundaries, which is always so hard for people to do in any situation with another person. I think it taps into a lot of our own insecurities about wanting to be liked by everybody, which I think is another one of those very common desires that most of us have, is to not actively put somebody off by, say, putting a boundary up. But what have your insights been through this process around boundaries as it pertains to a family member who's got an addiction going on, and what are your recommendations about how to set and keep them?
I think the biggest fear with setting boundaries with your loved one, and again, this is just my experience, but is the fear that if you set a boundary and something bad happens, you're going to blame yourself. So if I say you can no longer call me if you're using substances, and then something happens and they say, well, you cut me off, what did you expect? Which can happen. But I think there's that sense of blame yourself. Like, if I set this, something bad's going to happen and I'm going to have to live with that decision. And then also, like, when my brother got sober, I was afraid to set boundaries in case he would relapse, or maybe that would trigger him into doing something else. But what I learned was, by not setting boundaries, it almost made it worse for him, because he didn't have to have his natural consequences. And I wouldn't speak up when things were wrong. And that wasn't healthy for him, and it wasn't healthy for me. And I think everybody in my family would agree that, we all wish we would have set those boundaries. And again, boundaries aren't to change the person, they're to protect yourself. And that took a long time to work, or to figure out as well. So I think we all wish we would have set boundaries earlier with him.
Yeah. I mean, this idea that it seems like it shouldn't be such a stretch to say, like, I am deserving of safety, like I am deserving of stability. But there's some point along the way where things get twisted in our minds, And we start to see that as almost like as being selfish in
Mm-hmm.
some way. Like, oh, like if I'm not there for you, someone who I care about, with anything that you need, that means that like I'm not a good sister, or I'm not a good brother, or I'm, whatever the role is.
And I will say, in my experience, when we were younger and my brother would set a or my parents would set a boundary, he would use that against them. So I think there were points where we're like, "Oh my gosh, remember last time we did this and then this is what happened?" So I think there are instances where it does get used against you and then you get really fearful that it's going to happen again or something worse is going to happen. But they're so beneficial.
Yeah, well, and I think it also underscores, it links to this another really important concept of enabling, and how that helps prop up people's really maladaptive processes. But I think it has a lot to do with this question of, to what respect people's behaviors are their own responsibility versus that someone else, like, quote unquote, made me do it, or your job is to save me from myself. And I think I know this is also very present in trauma, when we work with people on trauma, where people will feel like, oh, like if I hadn't done this, then this other thing wouldn't have happened. Or this really tragic occurrence is my fault because maybe they had like one small piece of the overall picture, but really, like any part of the responsibility that was theirs was very tiny compared to what the other person bore.
Mhm.
I don't know. Does any of that resonate?
Oh, very, very, very much so. Yes. Yes. And it comes from a place of love, right? Like we want to help so much and we want to try to protect them as much as we can, but there is a point where we take on more than what we can handle and then we're not healthy either and then we can't help them if we're not healthy. So it is a very crazy dynamic.
Hmm. Yeah, I had I wasn't actually able to work with this individual, but just to give a quick anecdote, I got a call from someone about a week or two ago who felt that she was responsible for killing another member of the family because she had been basically the deliverer of someone else's fentanyl patch, and had brought this patch over to somebody else. That other person had used it, and then that other person had overdosed. And so this person felt that she was responsible for the death of the family member, even though literally all she did was bring something from one place to another in her car. But apparently this guilt had been dogging her for about 3 years,
Wow.
feeling like it was, if not for her, this person would have been alive. And I think we just have this natural inclination to want to feel like we have more responsibility and control over situations than we actually do. But that leads us, like you're saying, to not have boundaries, where actually, like, what we do have a lot of control over is our own experience,
Mhm.
and that's it.
Yeah, many points in my book. So I had an editor who was a psychologist, and she would make notes saying, maybe you shouldn't write this in here because this is dismissing the fact that he made a choice, or it wasn't, you couldn't control this point. But I struggled with it because yes, I know I can't control his choices and his choices are his own but I think in natural, just in any situation, we always think, what if I would have done this? Could I have done this? I think it's just a natural thing. And I wanted people in my book to see like it's okay to feel those things, even though they're incorrect thoughts. But it's natural just to have these, oh, if I wouldn't have done this, maybe he wouldn't have relapsed or whatever. Those are normal. But then again, we have to go back to what we can and can't control.
Yeah, and the wisdom to know the difference, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
um,
Yes.
but so let's talk for a second then about enabling, because this is a very common question that I get from parents and from family members about what is supportive behavior versus what is enabling behavior. So from your perspective and your experiences, where do you draw that line? What's actually helpful versus what's not?
I think it's a very gray area, and I think it's different for every person, just from my experience. But I do remember at one point, my mom, who tended to be the enabler, give him a little bit of money, do his laundry, make his appointments. She said, I am loving my son to death because no matter what I am enabling him to do, he's still making these choices. So, and then when he relapsed, we go back to these same things that we did 10 years ago. And a good friend of ours and a counselor said, you have to stop rescuing him. Every time you rescue him, you take away that, I don't know what the right word is, that will for him to change. He doesn't need to change if you continue to enable him to make these choices. So I don't have like a black and white of this is enabling and this is support, but I think you have to ask yourself, is the choice that I'm making now going to help them or going to hurt them in the long run? And it is okay to take a step back and let them make their own choices.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that long-term outlook is a really important one of saying, so where does this project out to?
Mhm.
And that idea that building discomfort is actually a positive thing, kind of like we were talking about before. This idea that if you're not uncomfortable, then why should you change? And I think that's kind of at the heart of what enabling is. A lot of times when I'm talking with people about this idea, I like to frame it as, is this going to move someone further away or closer to a healthier life?
Mhm.
And I think that gets to your point of that long-term outlook. If like if someone says, hey, I'm ready for treatment, but they don't have the money, like getting them into treatment, that's support. Like that's not enabling.
Right.
But doing their laundry so that they have clean clothes to wear because they're spending all their time high or drunk or recovering from it, like that might be more enabling.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is, so I have 3 children, and even though they're way younger, I always look, am I enabling them? Like, my job as a mom is to make
Yeah.
sure they grow up and be adults, so I'm not gonna be around to do their laundry, or I'm not gonna be there to be like, "Hey, did you pack your lunch today?" So I'm trying to start at, like, a younger age with them, so I feel like some of the stuff I've learned through my experience is trickling into my motherhood, like, "Oh, sorry, forgot your homework today. Not my problem. Like, this is life." So I think it's funny.
Yeah, well, that's true. Actually, I'm smacking myself for forgetting his name, but there's a therapist here in the Chicago area who did a TED talk and has got a really great perspective on how parents need to let their kids fail more because that's how you learn, and you can't just be there to swoop in and save them all the time. And not bringing your lunch and being hungry one day might actually be better in the long run. Like that teaches you something about responsibility.
Yep.
It's hard to do though. I think particularly, I'm not sure what age your children are actually, but mine are young. They're 7 and 5. So I know that as they've been particularly even younger than now, you're kind of almost in like constant martyr mode as a parent, where it's like, all right, like I got to take care of you. You're incapable of doing this for yourself. I just have to sacrifice myself for your well-being. But as they get older, that starts to shift a bit.
Yeah, mine are 12, 11, and 7, so I've been teaching them for a while. They can make their own meals and everything, but, it's so hard because inside you're like, "Oh, I'm sick to my stomach because they don't have a lunch," but if you think about it in the long term, they'll be better off for it, so.
Yes, that's you doing your job as a parent. Good job. Send them to school hungry. That's the way.
Right.
I'm just. It's true. It's true though. It's true though.
I know.
Um, so one other question I wanted to ask, because this is another dynamic that I feel like people get confused about, is this one of codependency. Could you explain how you define codependency? And then if someone's wondering, am I in a codependent relationship? Are there some signs or things that might be happening that you can look at and say, oh yes, this is the dynamic that you should watch out for?
So I don't know if I'm an expert in codependency, but I have done a lot of work on it with like my canoe analogy in my book that my therapist taught me. But for me, codependency is depending on somebody else's happiness for your happiness. So like for my family, it was like, oh, my brother's sober, so then we're happy. And then so we did everything for to maintain that. And then when it all fell apart, we didn't know who we even were anymore because everything we did revolved around his sobriety and him being sober. And so for me, that was a codependency piece. And, every time we would jump in and try to help him, it didn't help him because he wasn't, if we go back to that enabling, it was more enabling instead of supporting. And so it wasn't helping the codependency relationship at all. So my recommendation is for families who maybe do have a loved one in treatment, is obviously see a therapist to work through some of this, but try not to link your happiness with somebody else's behaviors, because when I look back now 10 years ago, I'm like, why? You spent so much time on somebody else, you lost 10 years of your life. But I was just so happy to have him back, and I would do anything for him. But at the same time, I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, now I can see the codependency.
Yeah. When you're not, when someone else has the remote control to your TV, and they can turn the volume up and down or pick the channel, like it puts you in a really vulnerable position, particularly if that person isn't healthy.
Yeah. Yeah, and then you almost feel guilty too, like, "Oh, I'm happy today. I'm doing really good. I've got this going on," when you know that they're struggling. And you're like, "Oh." But again, you have to say, "No, this is my life. I should feel happy. I should be, happy for what I'm doing."
Right. Particularly if families are like, if your family culture is one where you're all often, when you're together or enmeshed, I guess that word has a bit of a negative connotation, but when you're a little bit more collectivistic, it's tough if one person's suffering to be like, oh, like I can still be happy, or I still deserve happiness. But in truth, I mean, we kind of do it all the time. I mean, all you have to do is flip on the news and you'll see a lot of things that you could be really unhappy about, and
Mhm.
people whose lives are awful right now. And no matter when someone's listening to this podcast, that statement will still apply.
Right.
Yet that doesn't necessarily mean that we shouldn't ever be able to be happy because someone out there, either close to us or even just somewhere in our awareness, is having a hard time.
Mhm. Yeah.
I mean, it can be, but that's a choice that we make.
Right.
Yeah. It's tricky. I think when I think about all the dynamics that you wrote about in your book, and we just touched on a couple right now, a lot of what is so hard about the dynamics of addiction in terms of the people surrounding the person with the addiction is that it goes against your instincts. Like instinctually you feel like, oh, like my happiness should be tied to my family's happiness, or oh, they're hurting, I should assuage the pain, like I should make this better, when actually a lot of it's opposite when someone's sick with something like this.
Yeah, I think that's very well put. And I think that's why family members do like cycle in their head. I call it looping, because you're like, wait, why did I make that choice? Why am I backing away from him? Why am I not taking his phone calls when, you feel like you should be? And then you spend all this time thinking about those what ifs.
Yeah. Or you're like, when I love somebody, I do A, B, C, and D, but now I'm supposed to not do any of those things, and that's the right thing to do, is what
Mhm.
is what I'm being told. And it's just kind of like, even if it's true, or maybe it's the same, I guess ultimately what we're talking about, at least from the way that I see it, is that like the juicy center of it is the same, like the heart of it is the same. You're trying to help somebody, but the clothing that wears, like how you are helpful, has to change based on the circumstances.
It's very true.
Yeah. Well, so throughout all of this, so you go through so much with your brother, and you talk about it in the book. And obviously the story is over in some ways, not over in other ways. How do you make meaning from all of this? Was it a major factor in what led you into your career path right now? Is it something that you feel like has its fingerprints on your life on a daily basis? How do you make meaning from going through something like this?
Yeah, so I got into, obviously, my family started a nonprofit after going through my brother's initial one. And it's just always really driven me to want to do prevention education to prevent other families from going through that. And then when he relapsed, we kind of floundered. We're like, okay, so for the past 10 years, we've been providing hope and that people can recover, which they can and do. I have lots of friends in recovery, but we felt like, okay, should we even be talking about this anymore? Because we're not in that space. But then after some time and seeing a therapist, we're like, well, no, this is addiction. It's never a one and done, right? There's a lot of people who have to, they relapse and go through multiple treatments. So it's changed in the way that I talk about it. But what's really changed for me personally is that I learned that I can be happy no matter what happens with anybody else in my family. And before, I never really felt that. So if I have one takeaway from my book, it's just you can find happiness within yourself, even if your loved one is still struggling. Um, so yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, it seems like a theme for our conversation today, so far at least, has been this idea that the way you punctuate a sentence matters a lot. Like, where, are you responsible for somebody else's actions? Is their happiness responsible for your happiness? But also in terms of just the chapters of your life, like that period of time before his relapse, it's not like that didn't exist. And it's not like the experiences and the things that happened and that just winked out. I think one of my biggest pet peeves, honestly, in the recovery culture is counting days. Because I feel like counting days, although it can be helpful for some people, can be awful for others if you have a slip, which a lot of people have. And then it's like, oh my goodness, I just lost 3 months, 9 months, 2 years, 5 years of recovery. And it just makes it feel like there's this huge weight that just got put on you, when in fact there was a tremendous amount of value and positivity and growth that happened in that time, and that can happen again once you're back on meeting your goals again.
Yeah, I always see it as a learning experience. Like I could have just shut the door and said, I'm done, I'm not doing this anymore. But I'm like, this is life. This is what people are going through. And so I'm going to continue sharing however I can my story. But then it also plays a part in how I parent, how my relationships are with my friends, how they are with my parents. So I try to take it as a learning experience and what I can take away. Part of my journey was finding my own flaws. I don't speak up. I don't set boundaries. I don't have healthy relationships. And so I have to work on that myself, and it's definitely worth it. But I wouldn't have learned that if I wouldn't have gone through this. So I think that's really, really important for people. Sometimes parents are like, well, let's just, do what we have to do and close this chapter and move on with our lives. But again, all of these experiences we have are important and they play a role in our future. And so if you just say to somebody, okay, you went through treatment, we're closing this chapter, we're moving on, it kind of dismisses everything that they've been through. So I think we just have to be careful with how we word it, and we should always look at it as a learning experience.
Yeah. Well, and so I'd say that you're probably in the minority of people where you went through this time of struggle and then started a nonprofit. And I think that most people probably don't react by creating a nonprofit. It would be great if they did. I think that there'd be so many great resources in the world, but not everybody has the ability or to do something like that. What are some other ways that you've seen over the years people make meaning out of this and grow? Is it really just like truly an individual sort of thing? You also have now written a book, which is something that not everybody does, but is a very good way of like coalescing all those experiences and feelings and ideas into one place. Does everybody need their version of that, or are there different ways for people to move forward from that experience and grow?
I have friends in all different walks of life. Some have moved past it and moved on with their lives if they're a sibling. I have friends who have started parent resource networks within their school district because they have a friend who lost a child and they want to do more. So I think it's really what you're comfortable with. I wrote about it in the book, but it's hard when you have a loved one. You don't want to share too much because maybe they don't want their story out there. So it's kind of like, we all as a family wanted to share a story. We all wanted to start this nonprofit. And so for some whose loved one doesn't want people to know their past, they might not want to do that. So then if that person wants to get healthy or do some sort of helpful work, they could find either places to volunteer at where they don't necessarily need to share their story, but they can work with other families who are struggling, things like that.
Yeah, well, that makes a lot of sense. Everyone has their own way to make meaning from it. I think
Mhm.
there's actually a type of therapy called narrative therapy that works specifically on that. I can't say that I've been trained in it, but I think that's basically the idea of actually saying, well, I'm writing my own story, so I get to decide where the chapters are and what happens next, and it
Yeah.
can be very very empowering that way.
Yeah.
Well, so looking back in hindsight, uh, it's very easy sometimes, sometimes not so easy, sometimes it's still complex, but it's helpful to look back and say, here's how things could have panned out differently. And I know that being on the board of a prevention nonprofit myself, and you're very immersed in that community as well, that the work that we do is really this idea of how can we stop young people from going down this track where things completely go off the rails and someone's really in an addictive process. From your vantage point, what are ways to to do this work effectively? A lot of the people who listen to this podcast are in health, medicine, preventionists themselves. What's been successful from your perspective in terms of trying to catch kids early before they start going down this path?
I feel that kids need to hear it multiple times and multiple different ways. So, like learning about it one time in health class in seventh grade, obviously, they're going to go through different life experiences. So, I feel kids need to start hearing about it younger and different ways, some factuals, some stories. Because, you talk to a seventh grader who might be like, oh, I would never vape ever. And then they go into high school, right? And everybody's doing it. And they might have a different perception ninth grade. So I think multiple times a year, different ways. And I think parents need to be on board as well. We struggle. So we run a high risk class for kids who get caught at school, and their parents are required to do a parent night where they just learn more stuff. And we have parents fight us all the time that say, well, my 12-year-old was caught vaping at school and that was their choice. And I wasn't the one that did it. So I don't understand why I need to attend an education thing. I can't control what they do. But that sends a message to their child that it's not important to them. That's my thoughts on that. So I think more parents have to be more engaged in what their children are doing. Technology is so easy. I could text my kids right now, but I might not be having like meaningful conversations with them. So
Mhm.
parents need to be on board as well. And the worst thing you could ever say is it's not my kid,
Yeah,
because it can
because
happen
that
to anybody.
right, right. There's I feel like there's these thought traps that parents get into sometimes, like thinking like, well, my kid would never do that. That means that you're blind to it if it happens. Like it's just a way of looking at it. Or that other one that you mentioned earlier of, well, I can't control what they do. That is the biggest self-fulfilling prophecy I have ever heard. You know what I mean? You want to know how to make it so that you don't have an impact over your kid's behavior? Don't try. That's a
Right?
great way to do that. Like parents have a huge impact. Research has shown that time and time again.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like they care about what adults have to say.
Mhm.
Um, but sometimes it does get tricky. So another question I wanted to ask you, because this is almost always on the table when I'm talking with parents who have kids who are dealing with substance issues, is that they've got this friend group that's bad news, right? That's like they're drinking or they're supplying them with the vapes or the weed or whatever it is. And the child that the teenager, they love their friends. They're like, nothing's wrong with my friends. My friends are great. I want to hang out with them. And it's almost impossible to a certain extent to control where the child goes because they're like at school and they're hanging out after school. And that's almost like part of the ecosystem that they're in. How do you talk to parents about this issue where you've got this friend group that a child is very identified with, but is clearly a negative influence on their health and behavior?
I think it comes down to choices. So the teen you can do whatever and hang out, or you can hang out with whatever group of friends you want to, but these are my rules at home. And so I'm going to randomly drug test you. And if it comes back or I smell it on you, these are the consequences that are set for you. And they can't be consequences like you're grounded for the rest of your life, right? They have to be things that can actually happen. So if you have the consequences, they know the rules, then I feel they should be able to make the choices of who they want to hang out with. And hopefully over time, they're like, well, all you guys do is smoke marijuana. I don't want to hang out with you anymore because I can't engage in that behavior. So it's not fun. I feel like, and just being a teen myself, every time my parents are like, you can't hang out with them, I'd be like, oh, yes, I am. And I would make it a point to hang out with them. So I think you have to give them choices and let them decide what's best for them. But set rules, set guidelines. Hey, if you're driving my car and you're on my insurance, there's absolutely, you have to have negative drug tests or whatever it is that works for your family. But I do think that if you tell them no, they're just going to rebel.
So it's really about boundaries. It's about like we were talking about before, boundaries, rules, but then actually enforcing them consistently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep. And then
Yeah.
if you continue to use substances, even though we've given you all these consequences, then maybe it's time to get an assessment and get some professional help because you need it.
Yeah. Well, definitely. I think one of the axioms that I use in my work when talking with parents or when I'm thinking about how to conceptualize it when I'm working with a teen or an adult for that matter, I suppose, is that when people are behaving in a certain way that seems counterproductive, it just means that there's something that we don't know that they're getting from it. And if they're having all these punishments or all these consequences and they're continuing the behavior anyway, whatever it is they're getting must be so important to them that it matters more. I feel like humans ultimately are very utilitarian, where we're like, if the costs and benefit ratio doesn't work out, we're not going to do it anymore. Right. So clearly there's something really powerful. And when you've got a teenager or an adult alike, again, who are continually doing something that's like, they're doing poorly at school and they're grounded, or they're not getting the car, or they're going to get divorced, not for a 16-year-old, but like when all these things are happening and you're still doing the behavior, man, you must be running from something powerful, or there must be something going on.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And that's where professional help, like you were saying, really, really does help and really does matter. Because if something's that strong of a pull, I mean, as a parent, there's really only so much that you can do or that you're equipped to do. No.
Yeah,
No offense.
and I know there's parents who are like, oh, but I don't want my child to be viewed as this. So I would never reach out to a counselor. I don't want them to see a counselor because then they're going to be labeled. But I don't think parents realize that if you don't address it when you start seeing those signs of mental health or substance use, that it's only going to get worse most of the time. Not every time, but it can get worse to the point where, you're searching at midnight for your child, or you haven't heard from them in 3 days, and it's going to get way worse. So if we can advocate for getting help sooner, then I think we could save people from so much pain later on.
Yeah. Well, and I'd love to get your opinion on this. How early do you feel like parents should be talking with their kids about substances? Like when, in your opinion, when should that conversation first happen?
So I think early on, and it doesn't have to be like, this is a substance and this is what it does to you. It could be as simple as like, hey, there's unhealthy choices people make. They might ask you to put a substance in your body, never take a prescription pill. But I say at least fourth grade, start having some conversations. I have a 7-year-old, and we went to the Dells, and one of the shows we watch at home is To Catch a Smuggler because my son wants to do that. So we go to the Dells and she hands the person her backpack and she's like, there's no drugs in there. I'm like, oh my gosh. Okay, so just take the backpack and walk away. So, but I think having those, I mean, my 10-year-old is in 5th grade and she already hears about people vaping. And so I always tell people, if you don't talk to them about it, their friends are going to talk to them and they're going to tell them things, only the good parts. They're not going to tell them the consequences because they probably don't know. So I would say at least start in 4th grade because it's getting younger.
I totally agree with you. This is something I did a presentation for pediatricians a few months back on screening and assessment and for substance use disorders. And one of the most interesting elements from it, I actually interviewed a number of pediatricians who are experts in substance in that population and in primary care, and they were all in lockstep with what you're saying, that you've got to talk really young, younger than you think, about a lot of adult topics, sexual health, those sorts of things, because you want to be the person where they get that information from, and you want them to have an idea before they experience it. And ideally also, and I guess this is my extra layer, crafting an identity where that's not congruent with the person that they want to be, where they're thinking like, oh, like I want to put something in my body that could potentially harm me for fun. Like if you're hearing that, and that's just like so outside the realm of possibility for you, like why in the world would I do that? Like that sounds just as appetizing to me as like eating a dog, which is done in some places in the world, but here is it's not culturally accepted, and people wouldn't do it. It's that same sort of thing where you're just like, no, like I wouldn't do it. And if that's the reaction you have to these sorts of choices, as you grow and actually have it put in front of you, you're like, nope, not that interested in that, because that's just not how I see myself.
Right. Yeah, it's just, I can't stress enough that it is important to talk to them because so many kids are clueless, but also not in a way that they won't talk to you about things either. Because I think it's so easy to be like, if you ever vape, you're grounded for the rest of your life, right? Because then why would they tell you? So you have to do it in a way where they feel comfortable explaining things to you, what they're seeing in school. And so we always recommend like remain calm. So if that means like they tell you something, you need 20 minutes, walk away and then have a conversation. Because the minute we jump down their back, they're going to stop telling us anything, and then we're screwed and they won't come to us anymore. So we have to start young, but also in a way that they feel comfortable talking to us.
Yeah, absolutely. If they don't feel emotionally safe with you, they're not going to share anything, and that means with the hard stuff too. It doesn't mean that you don't set boundaries or there aren't consequences. But yeah, why would they talk to you if they just think that they're going to get hurt from it?
Right.
Yeah. Well, so one more question for you that I think is a really important one before we'll wrap things up for the day, but is about where you can get support through this process. And I know we've mentioned a couple times that therapists can be useful, and that's one option certainly if someone has the means and access to see a therapist, either from a family perspective or an individual one. But are there other resources that are available for families that are helpful in terms of navigating a situation where someone has an addiction in the family?
Yeah, there are resources, and it really just depends on your comfort level. There's some really great Facebook groups that are not anonymous, but they're private, so that you can go in and you can ask moms maybe that have similar situations, and you can see what they say. There's definitely like Alateen for teenagers. There's Al-Anon. Those are great support. If you have a loved one in treatment, there's usually family groups that you can go to. We on our website, we have a ton of resources, either webinars or podcasts on there too. So, I mean, I wish there was more than there is right now, but there are, and you have to kind of do some digging, and it all just depends on your comfort level. If you're not one that wants to go to a meeting, but you have time at 11 o'clock at night to watch a webinar, then search for those. But there are great resources out there.
Absolutely, including your book. I'll plug your book. You don't have to plug your book. I'll plug your book. The one other thing I want to throw out there is smart friends and family. Smart Recovery is second to 12-step fellowships in terms of prevalence across the country as a peer support recovery program, and they have their version of Al-Anon and Alateen called Smart Friends and Family. And for both 12-step fellowships and Smart Recovery, and I think other peer support communities as well. Everything's available online these days as well. And, so if someone is a little hesitant to actually go, you can go do like a Zoom lurk, like where you log in, but don't turn your camera on and just listen, like that's available too.
Yeah, that's awesome.
All right. Well, any final thoughts for the day before we call it? Anything that you'd like to leave our listeners with about your experiences and just how families cope with and navigate this whole recovery process?
Whew. I would say that no matter where you are in your journey, there's always room for growth and you can make it through it. I know some days feel like my mom always says, I'm afraid to cry about it because I feel like if I start, I'll never be able to stop. And so the work is hard, but it's worth it. And I feel like everybody in the family unit needs help in some way. So we can say, my loved one's going to treatment, they'll be fine, and our family will be better. But that's not always the case. So definitely find resources that work for you and speak to a therapist. But you can find happiness within all the chaos.
All right. Well, thank you, Ashleigh. And I really appreciate your book. I appreciate your time today and all of your experiences and knowledge that you've shared. You really have taken this experience and helped so many people. I mean, it's great if you can take something that has so much suffering in it and turn it around so that you can have a ripple effect. If not helping in your own situation, then making it so others don't have to go through it. So thank you for all that you do. Thanks for coming on the show today. And listeners, thanks for listening in as always.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
All right. Take care, everybody.